Hey everyone, welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. I'm your host, Ari Whitten, and today I have a podcast guest that I'm very excited about and a subject matter that I'm very excited about. This is something that I've never talked about before and never had a guest on that's talked about before, and something that I've just started to learn about relatively recently and really delve into the science myself on. My guest today is Jean-François Tremblay. And he has studied exercise physiology, biochemistry, and has a master's degree in pharmacology. He is a student and researcher at the University of Quebec in Montreal, and he's been researching in theory and in practice peptides and something called SARMs since the 1990s, and is widely regarded as one of the world's top experts on this rapidly growing science of peptides, which is the subject of today's podcast. So welcome to the show, Jean-François.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for coming on the show. So first of all, as I said to you just before we started recording here, probably 99.9% of the people listening to this podcast don't know much of anything about peptides. And, there's this whole sort of world. It's kind of an underground, it's sort of gray market world because there's a lot of websites selling these compounds and they're sort of very well regarded and they're a lot of attention is coming to them, especially within anti-aging medicine communities, functional medicine communities. So there's a sort of growing awareness of them, but they're still in this sort of gray market category of, they're chemicals sold for research purposes only, but you have all these people sort of buying and experimenting with these compounds. And there's, simultaneously, there's all these, pharmaceutical companies that are working on developing some of these compounds. And yet, even though there's a lot of science on some of these things that's been around for 20 plus years, most regular people have never heard of these things and have no idea about them. So kind of give me a broad overview of what peptides are to help people understand this topic more broadly.
Okay, well, peptides are very small. Okay, when you have a protein, if you break it down, it will break down eventually into peptides. And if you break it down one more step, it's gonna end up into amino acids. So basically a peptide is a chain of amino acids. Can start at 2 amino acids up to growth hormone is a peptide made of 191 amino acids. I don't know of any peptides much bigger than that, because at that point you start to have ramifications of chains of peptides, and at that point you would call them small proteins. So, but most peptides are like 10, 12, 15, 40, 50, 60 linked amino acids. That's very simple. And the human body is full of them. Actually, so far there was a paper that came out and we discovered over 7,000 already known peptides in the human body. If I know myself 100 and some of those, I consider myself lucky. So that's why they call it the new frontier, because it's really a new science. They are everywhere in the body. Each one is very specific to what it does. And it's all in all, it's pretty amazing. Every day almost they find a new one, and this one does this one does that. They don't have all positive effects. Some are not good to have too much, but many, yes. And those are the ones I work with.
Yeah. Now, hormones in the body are basically chains of amino acids as well. And are they technically peptides, or how does that break down?
Not all of them. As soon as you add something to that chain or that compound that is not an amino acid, then it's not a peptide anymore. So that's why not all hormones are, but yes, like insulin, growth hormone come to mind right away. And basically, I wouldn't stay in the realm of hormones because compared to the amount of peptides we have in the body, the few that are hormones, it's like a few, very few compared to all the peptides that are there.
Mhm.
So some peptides too are not hormones, but they act on hormones. I'm thinking of the growth hormone secretagogue. So it's a little peptide that acts on the pituitary gland to make it secrete growth hormone.
Mhm.
So it's part of that circle of things that makes growth hormone secretions.
Yeah. Now, peptides, I think more broadly, it sounds like you could say they're basically messenger molecules. They're signaling molecules that are.
In many cases, yes, signaling, that would be a better word to use.
Okay. Okay. Excellent. So another broad question for you. You know, I know a lot of these compounds, some of these growth hormones, secretagogues, we're going to talk about later, have been around for over 20 years now in some
Yes.
cases. And there's a lot of other compounds that have been around for a while. There's also, some of these have gone through clinical trials, have been even FDA approved in some cases, like tesamorelin,
That's right.
which, you know, for helping people lose visceral fat with HIV. And there's several other ones that have either have been FDA approved or are undergoing FDA approval. So given that some of these things have been around for quite a long time, why is it that they're just coming into the spotlight now? And why doesn't everyone already know about peptides?
Well, they came in this, it's basically the era of internet. So what was very underground before is not so underground anymore. It's like that biohacking movement, anti-aging movement. That's not new as of movement. It's new to the public because, you know, you have all those forums now, all those groups on the internet. So basically that's thanks to the internet. I bought my first book on anti-aging. I was 19 back in 82 when it was published. It was called Life Extension, a very thick book. And I still wonder how I got my hands on it. You know, no internet. I bought it. I don't know where, but you know, I found out about the book and I bought it. And I've been myself experimenting. I was kind of biohacking back then without knowing it. Plus, you know, a lot of those. I could call it the pre-biohacking era. And it was actually the bodybuilding era.
Yeah.
They were always looking, bodybuilders back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, looking for better ways to gain muscle mass. Of course, they came about anabolic steroids. That was an easy one. But always looking for options or better things or to push further. And being in that way an extreme sport and extreme in results, I mean, it's not normal to have so much muscle mass, then they would try all kind of things. So they brought up a lot of things that are mainstream now.
Mm-hmm.
That and one of them are peptides, actually. You know, the growth hormone secretagogue was first used, you know, from the gray market by bodybuilders.
Mm-hmm.
Even the tanning peptide, melanotan, you know, they all basically, often without knowing, because they want muscle, but they look into things and it works for muscle, but it works for other thing, and yeah, it's good for everybody.
Yeah. So bodybuilders have been using this for a decade or two now.
The growth hormone secretagogue, I don't, since it was discovered, I think it didn't take a year before they started to use it. I don't know how they did it, but those, you know, those groups like down in California, there were a few people like just searching and looking. And there was that guy, Dan Duchesne, who's dead now.
Yeah.
And he was kind of a visionaire. He was trying. He was the kind of guy who loved bodybuilding, but didn't have the genetic. So that pushed him to look for things, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And he would come up with things that nobody knew about and that now are mainstream in biohacking.
Yeah.
Listen, one supplement that came out of bodybuilding, because it's great to gain muscle mass, it's creatine. And nowadays, it's one of the bodybuilding supplements that I recommend to everybody, even if they don't train, because it's great for neuroprotection.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, it's hard for me to see products mainstream now. I'm not talking about the new products, but that were not at least investigated by bodybuilder, or they tried it. They say, okay, it's not good for muscle mass, but wait a minute, it's good for even nootropics. You know, they would use tweak with them to see if they would get a better concentration, better for the training.
Mm-hmm.
So they help pioneer a lot of things.
Yeah, bodybuilders were sort of the original biohackers decades before there was a term biohacking.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, they were injecting themselves with all kinds of stuff.
All kind of things, and you know, trying stuff and see what. I've done it myself. You know, I was one of those guys, not competitive bodybuilding, but yeah, I was training to gain muscle mass, and you know, back then in the 80s, 90s, you know, say, hey, let's try this, let's see if it works. What does it do?
Yeah,
and it served me good, actually. You know, I had never had bad experiences. So.
Yeah. Now, having said that, you know, bodybuilders were sort of instrumental in bringing peptides more into the public eye. There are many, many categories of peptides that are either sort of on the market or coming to the market. And to give people an overview of that, there's peptides for anti-aging purposes and longevity. There's peptides for tissue healing, injury healing. There's peptides for growth hormone, as you mentioned before. There's peptides involved in immune health and, you know, anti-cancer peptides. There's peptides for promoting brain health, nootropic peptides, and probably others that I'm leaving out of this. But I think, you know, that's probably a nice overview of the major categories. Would you like to add any?
No, it's a pretty good layout.
Okay.
I would add there is one category that they're bioregulators. They are from Russia. There is maybe 25 known used now. And it seems they found another 50 or so that now they're investigating which one are positive in their results and which one are not or useless. So in the next few years, more will come up. But yeah, basically that's a nice view of it. And well, there is one small part too. There are cosmetic peptides, like the tanning one. You know, it's purely cosmetic to get a tan, or some peptides are really good at repairing the skin, you know, in creams. So that's cosmetic, but hey, sure.
Yeah. Oh, and then there's also the ones for like sexual dysfunction. I know, like PT.
Oh yeah, that's a tanning one, and PT141, which is it's a variant of that doesn't have the tanning, but does have the erectile function. And it works so good. Actually, a company at one point wanted to put the melanotan on the market to compete with Viagra, because in many's experience, it's much better, much less side effects, and overall better effect, because it doesn't work locally with the nitric oxide system. It works in the brain.
Yeah.
So it's more than just the erection; it's the drive.
Yeah. Now
that comes back.
Yeah. So let's maybe start with, I think the anti-aging peptides would be really interesting to a lot of people. Can we talk about things like Epidolon and I think there's also one called Vilon, and I'm sure you're aware of some other ones that
Yeah.
would fall into this anti-aging category.
Okay, those are actually part of those Russian bioregulators. There's that medical doctor in Russia that was working with the army. And of course, you know, the Cold War and all that. So Russian, they say, okay, you find something that makes our soldiers better. So he started to investigate. He went into investigate peptides. That's almost 50 years ago. So the first one he found was epitalon. So, okay, maybe not so good for the soldiers, but he found amazing effect. First testing with dogs and mice and all that, and they live longer, they have better health. So a year passes, test on humans, and it turns out then, yes, people using them, they did long studies up to 15 years, groups of older people, and they found that in terms of actually living longer, that wasn't measurable. You know, after 15 years, they stopped the study, but they found that 67% of those using the epitalon, 67, the mortality rate was 67 lower in the group using epitalon. So a lot more survived, while a lot died in the group who wasn't using it.
Mm-hmm.
So they say, okay, well, it seems it worked to live longer. Plus a bunch of other effects that are, because it not only it would help to live you longer, but it would help to live better those years.
Mm-hmm.
They had an increase in short-term memory, for example, or an increase in bone density, or a decrease in the flu rates. You know, a bunch of positive effects that indicates better health overall over that time period. And the numbers it came up with, actually by extrapolation, is he believes, and I tend to believe too, that you could add 20 to 30 years to somebody's life by using those peptides.
Wow.
And which makes sense, because it seems that the normal, like the very, like 100% healthy and human being without, not affected by contamination, and like in a perfect setting, and it's even biblical, it's 120 years, and we start to see that with centenarians. They tend to approach 120, rarely pass it. So it seems that the limit for natural, if you're able to push it, is around 120. So now it's a bit over 80, at 30, 110, 120. Yeah, you know, it's about right in terms of numbers.
Yeah.
Is
Now,
approximation.
what's the actual mechanism of how epitalon works
Oh,
to extend longevity?
that's pretty amazing. Actually, when I found that out, I was really impressed. The what you would call the receptor of, it's a very small peptide, 4 amino acid, but its actual receptor is the DNA chain. It means that the peptide introduces itself within a specific section of the DNA, and it stays there. It doesn't. It's not a touch and go thing like hormone. It stays there, and it makes the chain to dilate locally in that area, and that dilatation is increases the expression of the genes in that area, positive expression that brings about better health.
Interesting. I know there's some sort of bit of controversy around what it does with telomerase and telomeres. Like there's some studies saying it lengthens telomeres, and other studies that didn't find that effect.
Yeah, there is one study right now being done. It's not over. They released preliminary data, but let's wait till it's finished. But the preliminary doesn't look good, actually. Yeah. So let's wait. At the end, they did it with mice. But thing is, the way they measured telomeres back then, I'm talking 20 years ago, I'm not very sure it was precise. So I wouldn't take that as written in the stone, because they came up with numbers like over 15 years it increased average the length of the telomere by roughly 15%, which would be great, but the way they measure it and the technology back then, even today, it's not like that great either. So I wouldn't take it as it is. But nevertheless, even if it doesn't do that, even if it doesn't add years to your life, what has been shown and experimented by a lot of people, it does increase your health and well-being overall over those years. That has been seen by so many people. So if it's just for that, it still make it a very, very worthwhile peptide to use.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the study that's going on now. I know you said let's wait for the data to be completed, but just when you say it doesn't look good, can you be specific about what?
Oh, yeah, it seems instead of living longer, they die younger.
Wow. Doesn't
look good. That's why I'm still pro epitalon, but with okay, let's wait to see what happened, what at the end of the study, and that's one study. It's a bit depressing actually to see the way it's going, but hey, let's see what happened.
Yeah. Okay. So any other promising anti-aging peptides or longevity promoting?
Okay.
Peptides?
Well, there is a few actually. Okay, this one is pretty cool. It's called FOXO4-DRI3. And
real quick, I'll just mention for everybody listening, this is the whole peptide topic is a whole other language. You guys are going to have to get
the names and all that.
Yeah, just be prepared for the rest of this podcast. He's going to be saying things like PT151 and MK677 and hexamorelin and ipamorelin. Like this is a whole other language of all the names of these things, and a lot of them just go by numbers and letters, and so just be aware of that, and we'll try to simplify things as much as possible, but those are the only names for these substances.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
But this one is the first study that made the Cell magazine, I think, showed that they used it with aging mice and 3-month therapy, and they took aging markers, and actually they were black mice that they were old already, so they had gray hair and all that. So visually after 3 months, the gray hair turned back black. And they extrapolated that in human years, they basically turned back the clock almost 20 years.
Wow.
They made the mice younger physiologically, but to the point where gray hair would turn back black, and they show pictures, and it's pretty amazing. So that peptide, actually we made a few grams of it already. It's not finished. The only drawback of that one, it's amazingly expensive. You're talking about $10,000 a month.
Wow.
Therapy, because if you know a bit about amino acids, you have the L form that occurs naturally in nature, and the D form, which is an isomer that doesn't occur normally in nature. So if you take methionine, for example, if you buy a gram of it for lab purposes, it's going to cost you $5 a gram. If you buy the D form, it's going to cost you $5,000.
Wow.
So if it's expensive, it's not out of greed. It's just that the raw material you need is expensive to start with, because it doesn't occur in nature. So it has to be made, and it's really not easy to make the D form. So it makes the whole, it's 43 amino acids, all of the D form. So it turns out to be very expensive. Hopefully people are working on, okay, let's say we throw in some L form of peptide, it still work. Probably they're trying all kind of variants right now to bring the price down.
Now,
But
are there, what, do you know the mechanism behind this substance, and what was the name of this one again?
FOXO4 DRI.
Okay.
So FOXO4, it's a gene, I believe. I'm not so sure about it at this point. I didn't have too many things in my head, but it works into cleaning. It does autophagy in the cells. So you increase the expression of that gene by using that peptide. So the autophagy would be increased, which is a good thing. And if it's pushed to the limit, well, you get all brand new cells, clean cells.
Yeah. Any other anti-aging peptides worth mentioning here?
Two promising one are the MUT-C peptide, works, and the humanin. They're two mitochondrial peptides. And studies have shown in animal at least that yes, it does increase their lifespan. That's for the life extension part. Plus working to improve mitochondrial functions. Of course, it will increase the energy level, so to say, of people, or wellness, yes.
Which is of particular interest to everybody listening to this podcast. So what's the mechanism there? You're saying it's acting on the mitochondria. Is it stimulating mitochondrial biogenesis or mitophagy or something like that?
A bit of everything. I think they're very special because they're signaling through the own mitochondria's DNA, not the cell DNA, but the mitochondria one. So they're so specific to the mitochondrial function in that sense. And I know for sure the MUT-C works a bit like it increases the mitochondrial activity, and I believe it increased the number of mitochondria, their increase in numbers. So by itself, you have more, so more energy.
Now, do those also have any, I would imagine if they have any performance enhancing characteristics, probably athletes have already been using them for years.
Not those one in particular, because there are compounds that are much cheaper that does that already to increase the number of mitochondria, the activity, increase vascularity in the muscles. It's the famous GW501, 516.
Right. And then there's
big alerts.
SR9009 as well.
Yeah, works more down the stream, but the end result is the same. So if you have people going to read about mostly the GW501, 516, one of the first thing that's going to pop out on
cancer
Google is the cancer thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's out from one study.
Yeah. Now, just to interrupt this, we're now broaching into a bit of a digression, which is like these two compounds are not technically peptides, correct?
No.
I know they're often lumped with SARMs, but they're also not technically.
They're not SARMs either. They're PPAR alpha, and the other one is something beta. Again,
yeah,
I'm getting old.
Well, I looked into this, the GW, I forget the rest of the letters, but it's also called cardarine.
It's a PPAR alpha activator.
Yeah, and it looks, some of the mechanisms look amazing to me. It's very appealing. But then I did see that link with cancer, and I'm like, nope.
Popping out. But you have to look at it this way. The study was done, it's one study that was done in mice, and it was to find out what kind of cancer you may have if you took that product. But when they do that, first they took mice that were predisposed to cancer, so they wouldn't have to wait too long to see what pops out. They gave them a lot of it, not like some people say like 1,000 times. They just didn't convert to human dose. It's maybe 20 times what's suggested usually, dosages. And they gave it to them for for 2 years, adult life of the mice, who lives 3 years. So it's like if a human was taking it for 50 years, 20 times the normal dose, and was predisposed to cancer. So I think a lot of compounds would have done the same thing. And even then, you say, okay, yes, but you have to keep in mind that that's a drug. Basically, it's not a peptide, it's a medication, it's a drug. All drugs many times work through various pathways. So one of the various pathways that drug works with is positive pathways, increase mitochondria's activity, increase everything we said. And through other pathways, it does induce cancer. But it's always a question of ratios. So because subsequent studies shown that at lower dosages, it can be cancer preventive. So now you're telling me, well, does it give cancer or does it prevent cancer? Well, the poison is in the dose. Because all those activities are enzymes controlled. So let's say that you take just a number, 20 milligrams. So the anti-cancer pathways will be stronger than the cancer pathways. So net effect, it's preventive. Now you increase the dose to 50. So the anti-cancer dose may be limited due to the enzyme limitation to a certain rate of activity, that it won't be more active than that to prevent cancer. But let's say the anti-cancer, the limiting ceiling is higher. So as you increase the dose, the anti-cancer activity compared to the pro-cancer activity, the balance shifts. And at one point, the pro-cancer side will win, and yes, it becomes, it will give cancer because it's, you understand what's happening. Yeah. So it's all a question of dosages. If you keep the dosage kind of low, then the anti-cancer pathway will win over the pro-cancer. Yeah. If you go too high, then you give a chance to the pro-cancer to take over, and then yes, it may give you a cancer.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't seen any of the research showing potential anti-cancer.
Because they were not conclusive. That's not what they were looking for. But they observed that, oh, it seems like it's cancer protecting. They couldn't conclude it because they didn't have all the parameters to back it up. But we say, well, there is a tendency to, it needs further investigation.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to switch, as fascinating as those topics are, I want to switch to some of the regenerative tissue healing peptides, things like BPC157 and TB500. Yes. And I believe also thymosin beta 4 falls into this category as well. But I'm personally particularly interested in BPC157. There seems to be some amazing research, especially in animal studies, showing, amazing things as far as ligament healing after ligament injuries and tendon injuries. I personally know many people who have healed from tendinitis with this after nothing else could heal them. And in addition to that, this is also one of the few orally active peptides. A lot of the others, we haven't mentioned this much, but a lot of the others need to be injected.
Most of them need, yeah.
Yeah, and BPC157 is orally active. It's also something that is produced naturally in our bodies. And what's of particular interest to, I think, people listening to this podcast, in addition to any physical injuries they may have, is the potential for gut healing that BPC may have. So can you
That's right.
talk a bit about, BPC157?
Yes. Actually, it's a peptide that so far, when I began working with it, and more so when we started to produce it, I would have been asked, do you think it would be good for this? Let's say, I don't know, the kidney. And I say, well, I don't know, try it. And bang, it was good for the kidney or for the liver or for this or for that. And it seems basically it heals everything. To different degrees, but yeah, it's very potent and overall healing peptides. As you said, it's naturally occurring, and if I may open a parenthesis, is that most of the peptides, one of the good things I like working with them, there are two reasons. One, they don't have any side effects, or very few.
Now, is that peptides in general or specifically BPC?
No, in general, with exception, if you take too much of a growth hormone secretagogue, you won't get side effect from the peptide itself. You would have side effects from the effect of the peptide, which is a secretion of growth hormone. And if you secrete too much for too long, you may have the carpal tunnel syndromes or IGF-1 going way too high. You don't want that. So, but it's not the peptide itself that would give you a side effect like, I don't know, a headache or this or that. They're practically devoid of side effects. And the biggest majority of them, you cannot overdose on them. So you cannot take too much by mistake and something bad will happen. Talking about the BPC, or repairing peptide, or TB500, or thymosin beta 4, it's actually dose related. The more you take, the more it's going to work. And talking of that, to another parenthesis, some people, they're going to tell you, yeah, but you increase cell division, so you may increase risk of cancer, a bad cell division. But that's a false argument, because if you have an injury or any type of repair happening in the body, the extra cell division will happen anyway. So what you do, you just change the parameters. So let's say it would take 3 months to heal naturally. You're going to have X amount of cell division for that to happen. If you take a product like BPC157, it's going to heal in 1 month. Maybe you're going to have 3 times the cell division, but in 3 times less and normal. So the total cell division in both cases will be roughly the same.
So it's just speeding up the rate at which
the process that would happen anyway. So you're not increasing the total number of cell divisions.
Okay.
And
but there's no risk of that stimulating cancer growth in any way?
I don't see it. So yeah, no. Listen, there are much worse things that not that you could do, that you do, that could give you cancer. Breathing the air outside. You may be as careful as you want about your food. There's still contaminants. It wouldn't be the first of my worries, cancer-wise.
Gotcha.
If you worry about cancer, look into other things before pointing that product or that class of product.
Okay. So talk to me about some of the positive research around BPC. What is it actually doing in the body?
Well, the actual mechanism is not quite sure yet. They don't know. They know pretty well the results. They're starting to investigate at the cell level what may be happening, but they're not so sure yet. But basically, it accelerates the repair process. And BPC has that particularity that it's very potent to repair the gut, the gastrointestinal tract from the mouth to the other end. It's very potent, if, like stomach ulcer, intestinal ulcer, intestinal permeability, up to actually I've seen myself a remission of Crohn's disease
Wow.
with BPC. Higher dosage for longer, but the longest took 3 months. And it was an actual remission of Crohn's disease. So it's that potent.
From what I've seen, comparing it to some of the other research on other compounds for promoting gut healing, I would, it's, you know, from what I've seen, I would probably bet money that BPC would be proven to be the single most powerful gut healing agent that maybe is known.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah.
It's you know, when I talk about that product, I feel like those people who were selling snake oils, you know, 100 years ago and said it's good for everything.
Yeah.
Well, this one is good for everything, but it does work.
Yeah.
So yeah, for the gut, it's amazingly good. And for tendon, ligament repair, tissue in general, it's even good for the brain repairs. They did one study with mice where they cut off the spinal cord, making them paraplegic. And under BPC, after a few weeks, the little mice were starting to kick again.
Wow.
Motion in their feet. So it did repair at that moment partially the spinal cord. So with sufficiency of time and peptide, you could eventually, I believe, heal that, which is very amazing.
Yeah. Now, there's another one in this category, TB500. Do you want to say any quick words on that? And then I want to transition to...
yeah, it's a very potent repairing peptide. For reasons I won't go into, it's more a question of dosages and all that, but it's the one you get a more immediate effect for tendon and ligaments and bones and all that. You know, if you have something that's really bothering, I would go with this one to get more of immediate relief. Not so good on the gastrointestinal tract, but very, very potent. And you talked about thymosin beta-4. The real actual TB500, thymosin beta-4 is a fraction of the big protein that it's called thymosin. It branches out, and one branch is thymosin beta-4, which is 243 amino acids. And the actual TB500 is, I think, 7 peptides that come out of that chain. So most of, so they're mixed up, you know, like, not a mistake, but like when I was selling it, I was advertising TB500 when it was actually thymosin beta-4. Now we're going to start to make the TB500 and the thymosin. They basically have the same effect. It's the repairing thing. But some people will tell you the actual TB500 is more potent. Of course it is. So if it's 7 amino acids instead of 43, so per milligrams, you get more molecule of the small one than the big one. So you have more molecule doing what that healing effect. So yes, so milligram per milligram, the TB500 would be more potent for that reason. And that's why we're going to start to make it.
Gotcha. Now, one thing I did see some concerning research on was thymosin beta-4. I did see, when I looked up that and cancer, I did see quite a few studies suggesting that it's expressed in tumor cells and maybe promotes metastasis. And
the earlier studies showed that. But now the question is it expressed? Okay, what came first? Is it the expression of the thymosin beta-4 that helped to the cancer, or is it there to fight the cancer? So now the tendency is to believe, no, it's showing up because it's actually helping in fighting against the cancer,
Gotcha.
not promoting it.
Interesting. Yeah, from what I saw, it just said sort of it's expressed in tumor cells, or is
Yeah.
found, is associated with tumor
Well,
cells, but they weren't
yeah,
necessarily saying it's causing the tumor or anything like that.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it seems like that actually it's there to help to put a stop to the tumor cells.
So one more question on the healing peptides, and then I want to transition to the growth hormone related stuff. So one distinction here is TB500 is not orally active; it has to be injected, whereas BPC is orally active.
Okay,
Uh, and
very
then
important. Yes.
yeah, and then one other question I have for you related to this is, I know there's at least one company, Dr. William Seed's company,
Mm.
that's making a compound called just BPC, not BPC157, and I guess it's sort of the mother peptide or something like
Or
that.
no, just marketing thing. It's or they call it BPC because they got some patent on it, but because they say they found a way to stabilize it. Uh, okay, it is active orally, but being basically a small protein, you will digest some of it anyway. So you lose more than half of it through digestion. So it is active orally, but it's not cost effective. You need to at least double and sum the dosages.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to use 0.5 milligram injected, then if you choose to do orally, probably you'll need to do 1 to 1.2 milligrams to have the equivalent effect. So if you have all the money to spend and you don't want to shoot, come on, blast yourself. But it's not cost effective. So any peptide, it's always most effective if injected, including BPC. But I understand some people, they have that fear of injections or I don't know what. So if you want to do it orally, that particular one can be taken orally.
Yeah, I'll say that I'm one of those people that has a fear of injections. I've never injected anything to myself, and it's I mean, I see some of the very positive research around some of these compounds, and they look great and they look like they have benefits, but I'm still like, oh, I really don't want to inject myself with anything.
Okay, but just keep in mind, diabetics, they do it a few times a day and
Right.
they don't have a choice, so they do it. And by the end of the day, after the first injection, you say, "Oh, that's it."
Yeah.
It's not really no big deal. But yeah, there is that line that sometimes is hard to cross.
Yeah. Okay. So next category, I know there's several other categories we could potentially talk about, but I want to make sure we talk about growth hormone related
Okay. Yes.
secretagogues. Now, more broadly, before we get into the specifics of these different compounds and what they do, why would somebody even be interested in growth hormone secretagogues? What is growth hormone good for, and what kinds of benefits do people get from these compounds?
Okay. Well, that's the $1,000,000 question. As we grow older, most of our hormones level go down. Testosterone, growth hormone, melatonin, for sleep, most of them, they go down. So the question is, do they go down because we grow old or we grow old because they go down? But point is, they do go down. And the main tendency in anti-aging with anti-aging therapists is, okay, let's bring them back to youthful levels. So that's why now you have TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, that is becoming very big and helping really a lot of men. We had it with women with postmenopausal who keep taking hormones. Um, and then you have growth hormone, which is a building hormone for tissues repair. It's very good for the skin if there are people interested in that. So basically, it's It's a growth hormone replacement therapy, except that in that case, the pituitary gland that secretes growth hormone never loses its capacity to secrete growth hormone. What diminishes is the stimuli to secrete it. So basically, when you take a growth hormone secretagogue, is you procure that stimuli. So bang, the pituitary start to produce again youthful level of growth hormone. When I'm talking youthful, I'm talking normal levels, not bodybuilder levels. You're not trying to gain 30 pounds of muscle. You just bring back your levels of growth hormone to what they were when you were 25. So basically, that's what you want to do. And for one reason, because if your growth hormone levels are too high, per se, it's not that bad. But you'll have one byproduct of growth hormone, which is IGF-1. And it has been shown that if you don't have enough IGF-1, you'll be more prone to cardiovascular disease. If you have too much, you'll be prone to cancer. So you want to keep that, remain in that normal range. So when you take actual growth hormone or growth hormone secretagogues, what has to remain in check are the IGF-1 levels. That's what should be checked regularly, and you adjust your dosages according to your response of IGF-1 levels. And keeping it in range, then yes, it's very healthy for anabolic processes in the body. Basically, yeah.
Okay. Now, some people are taking these things with the explicit intention to boost IGF-1, like for bodybuilding purposes.
Yes.
Now, knowing that maybe they, in the long term, with chronic use of that, they might put themselves at greater risk for cancer. Is that accurate?
Yes and no. Nature is funny in that way. You know, what you can do when you're young turns against you when you're old, like that. Meaning, we're designed to die. Basically, our whole biochemistry is rounded up around eventually killing us because we're designed to die. So what is good when you're young is not so good when you're old. Or actually, if you promote a process that is positive when you're young, promoting that same process when you're old, you're just accelerating that killing part of yourself. So that's why, like for the IGF-1, when you're young, that's when you need it for growth. It may not be so cancer promoting as when you're old. So maybe they don't need to worry so much. I would still worry because, you know, that's just an assumption I'm making. It's not proven, but it makes sense to me. So when you're less than, say, 35, I wouldn't worry so much about it, about cancer and all that. But that's a big mistake, you know. I've seen bodybuilders who bodybuild all their life, use drugs. Now they're 50, 60, they're still big, muscular, they still use high dosages. And because they look good, they think they're healthy. And first thing you know, they die a heart attack or things like that. And well, they don't because they're dead, but, you know, wonder what happened. Well, because what was good
if there's an afterlife, then they wonder what happened.
So, but you understand my point.
Yeah.
We're built for that, and so if you want to live longer than intended, you have to tweak with that biochemistry, because the biochemistry I have, eventually it's there to kill us.
Now, with that in mind, that frame you just presented, are you of the opinion that, let's say, testosterone replacement therapy or growth hormone secretagogues, which are often, you know, it's often presented in the context of anti-aging, do you think that those things are promoting accelerated aging and death?
They might.
Okay.
I'm not saying they are. I'm not saying they are not. They might. But at this point, you have to choose. That's a personal decision. Even if they were, it's a trade-off. You know, there is no free lunch in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Keep that in mind. So maybe you're trading off a little, but you're trading for better well-being. You know, do you want to reach 70 and with full health, or do you want to reach 80 and not even be able to stand up, for example, or be crippled or sick? Or that's what we see now. They slowly extend the life expectancy, but they don't extend the health expectancy years, which is around 69, 70. So that's why I'm not so much of a life extension promoter anymore. I'm more of a life health extension promoter.
Yeah. Health span versus lifespan, that distinction of how old
Exactly.
are you while still having a very functional brain and body and being energetic and so on.
Plus there is that question, you know, sociologists, they looked at, if I may divert a bit, they looked into that and they asked people, rich people, poor people, hey, do you want to live longer? So the poor people, they say, what for? You want to extend my misery, basically. And the rich people, surprisingly, a lot of them were not too crazy about living longer. Why? Because they were rich most of their lives. So they had it all, they have done it all, and they just wonder what else is there for me to experiment. I've done pretty much everything that could be done. I've traveled everywhere. I've been there. And so basically, you know what I found out? The people who want to live the longest, and that are those people who don't have strong beliefs. They're scared to death to die,
Mm-hmm.
basically. Those people, and you have the trans-humanitarian that are basically atheists.
Mm-hmm.
So they believe there's nothing after death. So they don't want to die because then it's over. So they try to extend it. And they're the one talking about merging computers with brains and stuff. So, but the strength of your belief has a lot to do with that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So going back to the growth hormone secretagogue, so these things are going to have some beneficial effects as far as promoting healing.
Yeah, youthful things happening, like more energy, better skin. Yes.
Better body composition, muscle gain, fat loss, things like that.
That's
Okay.
right.
Now, there's several different compounds in this category that we could talk about. So there's GHRP2 and 6, I believe. And then there's something called ipamorelin, sermorelin, tesamorelin.
Yeah, because there were generations. The first generation are the 2 and 6 you mentioned, because basically they're derivatives of ghrelin, the hunger hormone, which has an effect on growth hormone. So they found out that, if we modify it, the effect will be more potent on the growth hormone secretion. But they couldn't take away the hunger aspect of it. So when you use those, you're hungry like crazy, and which is not, most of the time, not a good thing. So a second generation came, then a third generation in which all the hunger effect was taken away. So they are modified. They are not exactly like the one we produce naturally, but they're pretty close.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so basically the third generation took away the hunger aspect, so it doesn't bring about hungers. And I know for sure ipamorelin, because all of those secretagogue would raise cortisol and prolactin levels. So the latest generations don't. They specifically promote growth hormone secretion. So that's why you see a lot of them, but I say, well, use the best, the latest generation, and no prolactin, no cortisol, no hunger. So
Yeah. Now,
ipamorelin is one of them.
yeah. Now, a lot of people are using ipamorelin.
Yes.
But there's also a lot of people who are combining it with something else, or saying that, hey, ipamorelin by itself, you're not really going to notice much of an effect from, but you need to combine it with something like this other compound called CJC 1295, or it's also called MOD-GRF.
That's right. Okay, that's a funny distinction between the two groups, because the CGC, because it crosses over in their action. I mean, if you take ipamorelin, you will have a burst of growth hormone and an increase in that burst. And same thing with the other one. But the first group will be stronger at promoting the actual secretion of growth hormone. And the second group will be stronger at promoting the quantity, or the peak of growth hormone that will show up in the blood. So now what they found out is that it's one of those cases when you combine them, you get 1 + 1 = 3 or 4 or 5 in some cases. So with much smaller dosages of each, you get a much higher results overall. So that's why when you combine them, you don't need to take so much, and you get the maximum secretion at that moment.
Interesting. Okay. Now, there's this CJC 1295 and with DAC on it, which, from what I read, stays in the body a very long time and sort of promotes higher baseline levels of growth hormone. Now,
yes.
my question there is, since growth hormone is meant to be sort of more of a pulsatile nature, like you're meant to have spikes at certain times during the day and night, and then go back down to, very little growth hormone. Is it problematic? I mean, I would suspect side effects are more likely if you're sort of creating a sort of constant baseline.
No, because even if it's there all the time, you still have pulses of growth hormone. You won't secrete all the time growth hormone. You're going to get a pulse, and maybe 2 hours after, pop, another pulse. But the problem with that one in particular, and I know it from the guy who synthesized the first CGC 1295 molecule, because it was invented here in Montreal. And actually the biochemist I work with was in the group, was working at the university in the group that invented that molecule. And yes, they did experiment with mice with CGC 1295. He remembers the mice who are giving the DAC version, getting bad cases of cancer, blood cancer, because with DAC make the molecule bind to the 1-albumin in the blood, and they didn't investigate the how and why, but basically it provoked cancer in that albumin that turns into blood cancer, basically. So he always tells me, he said, no, don't use this
one. Don't do the CJC with the
don't
DAC
do it. DAC long term, it's bad news.
Okay. Now, do you think the one without the DAC, the MOD-GRF, is relatively safe? Do you think?
Yeah, it's very safe because there is no albumin binding done, so it doesn't affect at that level.
Okay. Do you think there's any concern? I mean, saying what you said before about, the potential link between higher levels of IGF-1 and higher risk of cancer. Is there a link between, somebody doing cycles of using these growth hormone secretagogues and increasing the risk of cancer as a result of it?
Yes and no. It depends. It depends on the actual IGF-1 levels you reach. That's why you need to monitor that and adjust thereafter the dosages of growth hormone secretion. Because some people actually will have raised growth hormone, but very little IGF-1, because that's dependent too on your glucose level at the time. If you have high glucose, levels at the time of intake, the synthesis of IGF-1 by the liver won't happen, or not so well. So a lot less will be produced. That's why usually it's good practice not to eat at least an hour before and not eat like half an hour after. So blood glucose level are in check to have the better effect on IGF-1.
It will have more of an effect. It will raise IGF-1 more.
Much more, yeah.
If you take it in a fasted state, away from meals.
That's right.
Okay.
That's why for that purpose, the two best times would be right when you wake up or right before you go to bed, assuming that you didn't eat hopefully a couple of hours before you go to bed. So that would be a perfect time. Or when you wake up and you wait at least half an hour before you eat anything. Okay. So those would be the two best times to dose.
Okay. Now, if somebody was going to get into experimenting with some of these growth hormone secretagogues, would the best choices, in your opinion, be ipamorelin and mod-GRF? Or
yeah. Yes, that's the only one my company sells. I came to the conclusion that's the best combination you can have. So why bother with the other ones?
Okay, gotcha. Now, is there any potential for intranasal application of these?
That's a good question. Intranasal is, I'm sure there is some absorption of it. I don't know the percentage of, so I don't know if it's absorbed at 10% or at 90%. But I know that some peptides are very efficient intranasally, but those in particular, I know they're sold as, but I don't know how efficient they are. I would have to look into it if there is any studies done.
Yeah, I did find one on ipamorelin intranasally. They said bioavailability was 20%.
Okay, there you go.
And so it's obviously less cost effective, but
again, for somebody like you, then that would be an option.
Somebody who wants to avoid injections.
There you go. I think it has to do with the size of the peptide, because those that showed high availability were very small peptides.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
Well, not only size, structure, a bunch of factors.
Gotcha. Well, I know we've gone a little bit over time here. I thank you for spending a little extra time with me. I know I want to mention on a final note, you have a company that you've mentioned a few times in passing called, I believe it's called Can Lab.
Can Lab.
Yeah, and it's canlab.net. Is that correct?
That's the web store, but the best way, if you want to read, I'm not much of a writer actually, but I have a Facebook page for Can Lab. Mm-hmm. So just look up Can Lab on Facebook, and that, if you're interested, would link you to the store. And I write little articles sometimes there on the products, but not much. I should write more.
Okay. And on this note, I want to mention, this is a gray market area. And these chemicals are sold, I believe they're technically labeled as for research purposes only, not for human use.
That's right.
And also I want to mention that from what I've read, there are a lot of companies out there selling these peptides online. Like someone can do a search for any of the things that we just mentioned in this podcast, and there'll be 20 companies that come up selling these peptides. But from what I've seen, there's a real concern over a lot of what these companies are selling is not actually legitimate and not what they say they are. And there's a lot of fake substances going around.
Fake or underdosed or poor quality, or most of them come from China. Listen, they did one study on one in particular, and they found bacteria in the vials. So that was after the Chinese flu there, but I'm sure nobody wants Chinese bacteria in their shots. It's not a good thing. Anywhere they come from. So, sometimes, and another study was done in Scandinavia where they show that about 15 vials from different internet resellers. And they systematically, they were all selling the product at 10 milligrams, and they all had 5 milligrams. So basically, you are not getting what you are paying for.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the thing. And that's actually the main reason I started the company. I never thought it would grow so big. It was mostly for myself to have peptides that I knew what I was taking. And when it's actually made in for research only setting like ours, it is an actual research peptide producing lab. So we don't buy the products from anywhere else. The quality is at least as good as pharmaceutical, because when you do research, there is one thing you don't want to change or vary, you don't want it as a variable, is the product itself you're testing. So the protocol to make them, the quality of the product has to be up there.
Mm-hmm. And so you're synthesizing these compounds in your own lab?
In Montreal. Well, actually, it's within the university. There is kind of a symbiosis where the university rents space, and in exchange, the lab do things for the university. So, it's a symbiosis thing, so it's done. But all the compounds that are synthesized in that lab are for actual research purposes, for real research. Like there is this professor and medical doctor is leading research in anti-cancer peptides used as vectors, so they can bring across the brain-blood barrier any drugs that normally wouldn't go. So it's a breakthrough for brain cancers. It's top quality, basically.
Okay, excellent. So on a final note, if somebody's interested in using some of these compounds, obviously make sure to get them from a trusted source. I will also say personally, I have no vested interest here. I don't have any financial alliances. I don't make any commission if you buy from Jean-François or anything like that. I just want to make sure you don't get fake stuff or dangerous stuff if you do try to use this stuff. On a final note, I know you recommended your Facebook page. Is there any other trusted resource that you have for reading on this stuff? Because I know there's a lot of misinformation out there.
No, but if you keep up with my page on CanLab, I'm working because again, there are sources. Some are better than others, but not 100%. There's still something that say, well, no, that's not good. So I have a hard time referring to those pages because eventually it's not 100%. So it's not that reliable. The best source is PubMed, and go into deep research if you have the time and everything, but it's very time consuming.
Okay. And once again, your website where they can, where you manufacture and sell these compounds is CanLab, CANLAB.net.
.net. And it's more of a web store. No pictures, no description, no nothing. When you go there, that's because you know what you want. It's not informative at all.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jean-François. This has been absolutely fascinating. This is a topic that I'm fascinated with, and this was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with my audience. I appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome, and thanks to you.
Yeah. Hey there, this is Ari again. One more quick thing before you go. Just make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Energy Blueprint, and also make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or anything else. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview, and I will see you again next week.